2 kids were found frozen in a living room freezer. Their mother confessed without flinching. "I killed them." She said it was to protect her youngest. But no evidence backed her claims. No abuse, no signs, just silence, and 2 bodies buried in ice. She starved them, beat them, made them confess. Then she made them disappear. But was it justice, or something far darker? It was heavy, cloying, the kind of rot that clings to skin and fabric. The freezer sat silently in the living room of an otherwise abandoned apartment on Detroit's east side. When officers pried it open, layers of frozen air rushed out, laced with the sharp stench of death. Inside, beneath a thin plastic sheet, a child's foot protruded, pale, rigid, with curled toes. Closer inspection revealed a plastic bag knotted tightly over a face. The skin beneath was bruised, discolored. A second body lay beneath, smaller. Both were frozen solid. Crime scene technicians documented the area. The freezer was unplugged, but still held residual cold. There were no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, only the 2 lifeless bodies, crammed together under a pile of old clothing and food wrappers. One wore a pair of pajama pants. The other was partially wrapped in a cartoon-themed blanket. Identification came within hours. The bodies belonged to Stephen Gage Berry, age 9, and Stoni Ann Blair, age 13, both biological children of Michelle Angela Blair, the woman who had lived in the apartment until her eviction 2 days earlier. The crime scene indicated a level of familiarity between killer and victims. There was no concealment in the traditional sense. The freezer sat in the main living space, openly accessible. The rest of the apartment was sparsely furnished. A stained mattress, children's clothes, scattered textbooks. The bodies had not been moved in panic. They had been placed deliberately, with the clear intention of remaining undisturbed. Michelle Blair was located at a nearby unit in the same housing complex, accompanied by 2 younger children. She showed no signs of being on the run. When questioned, she admitted, without prompting, that the children in the freezer were hers, and that she had killed them. There was no hesitation, no evasion. According to her own account, the murders occurred nearly a year apart. Stephen was killed first, followed by Stoni months later. She stated that both had sexually abused her youngest son. That justification, repeated across interviews, remains uncorroborated. No physical evidence supported the claim of sexual abuse. The surviving children offered no statements confirming it. Blair's insistence on this narrative appeared to serve 2 purposes: moral validation of the killings and psychological reinforcement of her perceived role as protector. This form of cognitive reframing is not uncommon among offenders who commit intra-familial homicide under self-justified motives. What stands out is the lack of concealment. Keeping both bodies inside a communal space, accessible to the other children, suggests a form of psychological control extending beyond death. In similar cases, such positioning often functions as a deterrent, a grim warning to others within the offender's environment. It reinforces authority, especially when the perpetrator views themselves as enforcer of a moral or disciplinary code. Michelle Blair's background showed prior incidents of domestic violence, school absences, and welfare interventions, yet none escalated to the level that would predict filicide. Her actions were not impulsive. She admitted to isolating the victims, interrogating them for days, and finally carrying out the killings through suffocation, blunt force, and starvation. Afterward, she resumed daily life with the surviving children. She continued taking them to school. No one asked where the others had gone. This absence of external accountability reflects a systemic failure, one that allowed 2 missing children to vanish without question. Neighbors later reported not seeing Stephen or Stoni in over a year, but assumed they had moved. Schools marked them as transferred. Michelle gave vague explanations when asked, and no one followed up. What remains most unsettling is not only the brutality of the acts, but the calm, deliberate routine that followed them. The freezer didn't merely preserve the bodies, it preserved silence. That silence was broken only by a final eviction, a locksmith, and the unmistakable stench of death seeping into the hallway. What internal process allows a parent to live inches from their victims, day after day, without apparent remorse? That question, more than any physical clue, defines the psychological core of this case and shapes the path for deeper forensic analysis to follow. The interrogation room was silent, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Michelle Blair sat with her hands folded on the table. Her posture was steady, eyes alert, her voice calm. There were no signs of distress or hesitation. When asked about the contents of the freezer, she responded clearly, "I killed them." This admission was delivered without coercion, without prompting. Her tone lacked remorse. She did not avert her gaze. In fact, she seemed to assert ownership over the act, not as a confession in the traditional sense, but as a declaration. This early admission, before the investigators had fully introduced the evidence, is consistent with a psychological need to maintain narrative control, to be the one who tells the story, not the one who is told what happened. Throughout the interview, Blair provided detailed descriptions of her actions. She described isolating Stephen in the bedroom, withholding food, beating him with objects around the house, and ultimately pouring scalding water on his genitals and back. She recounted his screams, his confusion, his physical collapse. Yet, she expressed no discomfort in doing so. Her affect remained flat. The delivery of these details was clinical. When asked why, she stated repeatedly that he had sexually assaulted his younger brother. She claimed that he had confessed, and that she had acted to protect her youngest child. However, no corroborating evidence supported this claim. No physical signs of abuse were present. No witness confirmed any inappropriate behavior. Blair's justification appeared to stem not from external facts, but from internal conviction, or possibly constructed belief. Psychologically, this reveals a significant cognitive distortion, a shift in moral reasoning that allowed her to reinterpret extreme violence as maternal protection. This phenomenon has been observed in cases where a caregiver's identity becomes entirely fused with the role of protector, leading to hypervigilance, paranoia, and ultimately preemptive aggression. In Blair's case, this role became absolute. Anyone perceived to pose a threat, whether real or imagined, was subject to elimination. After Stephen's death, she kept his body in the freezer and resumed daily life. No one questioned her. The lack of external scrutiny likely reinforced a sense of justification and control. Months later, she claimed that Stoni had also admitted to abuse. The pattern repeated: isolation, starvation, beating, suffocation. Again, the justification followed the act, not the other way around. One notable feature of Blair's statement is her repeated use of certainty. She spoke in absolutes. They did it. They knew what they were doing. They had to go. These statements suggest a psychological rigidity, common in individuals with black and white thinking patterns. There was no space in her mind for doubt, for nuance, or for developmental understanding of her children's behavior. Once labeled as dangerous, they ceased to exist as children in her perception. She also emphasized that her actions were not impulsive. She described taking time to interrogate the children, monitoring their responses, and making sure before acting. This level of deliberation contradicts any notion of temporary insanity or emotional overload. Instead, it points to a calculated decision, shaped by a distorted internal logic. Notably, she showed more emotional activation when discussing the well-being of the surviving child than when describing the deaths of the others. She cried only when she believed her youngest would be judged harshly or treated differently because of his siblings. This selective emotional response suggests that her capacity for empathy remained intact, but was narrowly focused, almost exclusively on the child she identified as a victim. At no point did she inquire about legal consequences. She expressed no concern about being arrested or prosecuted. This detachment may reflect a resigned worldview, or a belief that punishment, in her mind, had already been delivered, by her own hand, in her own household, according to rules she alone enforced. The structure of Blair's confession, calm, detailed, morally justified, aligns with profiles of offenders who construct private systems of justice within isolated environments. These individuals often lack trust in formal institutions and replace them with internalized codes. Over time, they become judge, jury, and executioner. The next phase of analysis must examine the developmental origins of this mindset. What led Michelle Blair to believe that the only solution to perceived abuse was death, and that the only enforcer qualified to deliver it was herself? The structure and progression of Michelle Blair's violence were deliberate. Her actions followed a repeated pattern: accusation, isolation, interrogation, physical punishment, and eventual execution. This sequence was not impulsive. It was sustained over days, sometimes weeks, reflecting a high degree of psychological planning and behavioral control. At each stage, she maintained dominance not only through force, but through coercion of confession. Blair claimed that both victims, Stephen and Stoni, admitted to sexually abusing their younger sibling. However, the methods she used to obtain those confessions were not investigative. They were punitive. She denied food, restricted access to the bathroom, forced the children to stand in stress positions, and beat them with blunt objects. In her recorded statement, she recounted forcing Stephen to stand in the corner for hours, refusing to let him eat, and beating him with a wooden stick and an extension cord. The goal was not discovery of truth, but submission. One of the most disturbing elements in her description was her admission that she placed Stephen in a bathtub filled with scalding water. According to her, she made him sit down, despite his screams, and when he tried to escape, she pushed him back under. This act represents more than just physical abuse. It reflects a shift toward symbolic violence. The bath, typically associated with cleansing or comfort, was weaponized as a tool of humiliation and destruction. The repeated use of hot water suggests a ritualistic element, indicating that Blair associated physical pain with moral punishment. She was not merely trying to harm. She was trying to erase what she perceived as contamination. The child, in her view, had become irredeemable. The method of punishment escalated accordingly. Similar dynamics were present in Stoni's case. Blair described withholding food, taping her daughter's mouth shut, and suffocating her with a plastic bag. She claimed Stoni also confessed after days of physical and psychological torment. The timeline indicates that these confessions were coerced under duress. Prolonged deprivation, assault, and the looming presence of a previously murdered sibling likely broke the victim's resistance. In psychological terms, this environment was equivalent to forced compliance. The children were cornered, vulnerable, and aware of the fatal consequences of refusal. Throughout both cases, Blair used language that framed her actions as necessary. She spoke of handling the problem, protecting the other children, and making sure they never hurt anyone again. This framing allowed her to bypass internal guilt, constructing a moral code in which she held unilateral authority. Her identity as a mother had morphed into that of judge and executioner, rationalized by an internal logic that did not rely on external validation. There were also elements of behavioral rehearsal. The tools of punishment, cords, hot water, plastic bags, were readily available in the home. They were chosen, prepared, and used in repeated episodes. This repetition indicates a learned process, where Blair adjusted her methods based on outcome. For instance, after Stephen's death, she expressed frustration that she hadn't ended his life sooner. With Stoni, the process was more methodical, more immediate. The emotional flatness with which she recounted these actions underscores a form of emotional detachment that often appears in individuals who compartmentalize violence. There was no sign of psychological disintegration. Instead, there was evidence of cognitive reinforcement, a belief system that grew stronger with each act. Each death was not perceived as a failure, but as a resolution. In her mind, order had been restored. Of particular concern is the environment in which these acts occurred. The surviving children witnessed aspects of the violence. They were instructed to stay silent, to lie when questioned, and to participate in the family's new normal. This imposed secrecy, reinforced by proximity to death, created an atmosphere of sustained trauma and emotional conditioning. The freezer did not just store remains, it anchored control. Every child in that household was governed by the unspoken understanding of what happened to those who disobeyed. There is still no clinical evidence that Stephen or Stoni engaged in any form of abuse. Their so-called confessions, if they occurred, were extracted under conditions of extreme coercion. The reality suggests that Blair's accusations may have originated from personal trauma, distorted memory, or projected rage. The question remains, did she believe her children were guilty, or did she need them to be? This distinction will shape how the final stages of psychological evaluation are approached. Determining whether Blair acted out of delusion, vengeance, or calculated domination is essential to understanding the full depth of this case. Michelle Blair's stated motive, protecting her youngest child from sexual abuse, does not align with the available evidence. No forensic findings, psychological evaluations, or witness testimonies substantiated her claims. The surviving children did not confirm any incidents of abuse. Medical examinations showed no signs of trauma consistent with her accusations. These discrepancies raise critical questions about Blair's internal logic and the psychological mechanisms driving her behavior. The absence of external validation suggests that the motive was not rooted in objective reality, but in a personal narrative shaped by unresolved trauma and distorted perception. Blair disclosed a history of being sexually abused during childhood, and while no official records confirmed the extent or specifics, trauma of this nature is a known risk factor for later maladaptive behavior. In some cases, early victimization leads to hypervigilance and the formation of rigid protective roles, especially when the individual assumes primary caregiving responsibilities. In Blair's case, her identity as a mother appeared to merge with an idealized archetype of the avenger, someone who not only nurtures but eliminates perceived threats. This fusion created a mental framework where moral decisions were made in isolation from social norms, driven instead by internalized logic. The boundaries between punishment and protection became indistinguishable. Once she labeled a child as dangerous, no appeal or intervention could reverse that judgment. This type of thinking is commonly associated with certain personality disturbances, particularly borderline and paranoid traits. Individuals with such patterns often experience intense emotions, unstable interpersonal relationships, and an overwhelming need for control. They may exhibit dichotomous thinking, viewing people as entirely good or evil, and respond to perceived betrayal with disproportionate hostility. In Blair's case, both victims were her own children, yet she spoke of them not as children, but as corrupted entities. Her language reflected dehumanization. They became objects of moral contamination that needed to be removed. The methods of interrogation and punishment further reinforce this interpretation. Blair did not act in a moment of rage. She observed, waited, and administered what she perceived as justice. This deliberate process shows a level of cognitive organization incompatible with acute psychosis. There was no evidence of hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thought. Instead, her actions reflect sustained conviction, one rooted in personal history and emotional reasoning rather than factual analysis. She reported that the children eventually confessed to the alleged abuse. However, under extreme duress, prolonged isolation, and physical torture, such confessions cannot be treated as credible. Psychological coercion at that level is known to produce false admissions, especially among children. The need for control, for affirmation of her beliefs, may have outweighed any interest in discovering the truth. Once she internalized the idea that her children had violated her moral code, she pursued validation through forced compliance rather than investigation. Another possible factor is narcissistic injury. Individuals who carry unprocessed shame or humiliation from early life experiences may react aggressively when their identity is threatened. In Blair's narrative, the idea that her children could commit sexual abuse was intolerable. It was not just a threat to her youngest child, but a personal betrayal, an offense that invalidated her role as protector. This perceived collapse of identity may have triggered a need to reassert dominance, not only through punishment, but through annihilation of the perceived source. Despite her repeated statements about protecting her family, Blair made no effort to involve law enforcement, social services, or medical professionals. Her actions were concealed, isolated, and carefully maintained. This secrecy indicates that at some level, she understood her behavior would be viewed as unacceptable by society. Yet rather than seeking help, she deepened her internal justification, reinforcing her belief in moral superiority. What remains unclear is whether she truly believed the accusations she made, or whether they were constructed retroactively to justify the violence. This distinction is essential. If she believed the claims, her behavior points toward delusional protectiveness shaped by trauma. If not, it may reflect manipulative rationalization, a way to legitimize otherwise indefensible acts. The psychological profile of Michelle Blair cannot be captured by a single diagnosis or motive. It reflects the convergence of early trauma, rigid morality, distorted maternal identity, and unresolved rage. Her perception of justice became entirely self-referential, immune to external challenge. What psychological mechanisms allowed her to maintain this system of belief, unshaken, even as the consequences unfolded around her? That question remains central to understanding the depth of her pathology and the limits of accountability when trauma and power intersect. Michelle Blair was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was delivered swiftly as she waived her right to trial and entered a guilty plea. In court, she showed no remorse, instead reiterating that her actions were necessary and justified. The courtroom was silent as she calmly detailed the abuse she believed her children had committed and explained why she felt their deaths were deserved. Her demeanor remained consistent throughout, composed, detached, and resolute. The legal outcome reflected the severity of the crimes, but also the clarity of intent. This was not a case complicated by questions of mental incompetence or diminished capacity. Psychological evaluations concluded that Blair was fit to stand trial. She demonstrated full awareness of her actions and their consequences. Her decisions were organized, deliberate, and aligned with a fixed internal belief system that had replaced any reliance on external moral frameworks. The surviving children were immediately placed into protective custody. Both underwent psychological assessments and trauma-informed care. Interviews indicated that they had been exposed to prolonged physical punishment, emotional manipulation, and the visible presence of death in their home. They described being instructed to lie about their siblings' whereabouts and living with the knowledge that disobedience could result in fatal consequences. These conditions mirror those found in high-control environments, where fear is used as a primary tool of behavioral regulation. Clinicians reported signs of complex trauma in both children. Symptoms included dissociation, emotional numbness, chronic anxiety, and signs of hypervigilance. The younger child, whom Blair claimed to be protecting, exhibited a particularly conflicted attachment style, expressing loyalty toward his mother while also describing feelings of fear and confusion. The process of recovery for children raised in such conditions is long-term and layered. They must reconstruct not only their understanding of safety, but also reframe their concept of parental authority and care. On a broader scale, the case revealed systemic gaps in social oversight. Records showed that the children had been removed from school, that previous welfare checks had been inconsistent, and that concerns raised by neighbors and relatives went unaddressed. The lack of sustained intervention allowed the conditions inside the household to escalate without detection. This failure was not due to a single oversight, but a combination of institutional blind spots, limited resources, and a system that often fails to recognize the warning signs of concealed familial violence. Blair's ability to maintain control over her environment, conceal the deaths for years, and construct a narrative that framed herself as a protective mother speaks to the complexity of her psychological profile. She did not act under temporary duress or psychotic delusion. Instead, she operated under a fixed, self-reinforcing belief structure, where moral judgment was internalized, absolute, and unchallenged. Once her children were perceived as threats, their humanity was nullified in her perception. This dehumanization is a critical psychological factor that enabled the killings to occur and persist without psychological collapse. The long-term impact of the case extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It raised public questions about the definition of maternal instinct, the nature of justice within the family unit, and how trauma can distort caregiving into control. In forensic psychology, the case has been used to examine how early victimization, untreated mental health issues, and emotional isolation can coalesce into violence, particularly in closed domestic settings. Michelle Blair remains incarcerated. The surviving children continue treatment under state supervision. The apartment where the crimes occurred has since been cleared and reassigned, though residents in the area still recall the events with unease. The physical evidence is gone, but the psychological imprint remains. This case serves as a stark reminder of how untreated trauma and distorted belief systems can lead to catastrophic outcomes when left unchecked. It challenges assumptions about motive, motherhood, and moral clarity. In the end, the most disturbing aspect may not be the violence itself, but how quietly and invisibly it was allowed to unfold, behind closed doors, in silence, for years.